Welcome back to another live Mast Cell 360 webinar. I'm your host, Jamie Fries-Miller. I'm a health coach here with Mast Cell 360, and I just wanted to say on behalf of all of us, we are glad to have you here as part of our community. Let us know in the comments, are you catching the show live or catching the replay? This month, welcome to June, right? We will be focusing on hormones. So make sure to mark your calendar for 1 p.m. on Mondays if this is a topic you're curious about. We're kicking the month off with today's topic, how to support your adrenals, understanding MCAS and cortisol, the stress hormone. This might be something you're interested in since many of us in the MCAS community have or are experiencing adrenal fatigue. I'll be joined today by our other Mast Cell 360 practitioners, Alex Bingham, Kimberly Quirk, and Lachey McKeel. All right, before we jump into today's topic, just some brief housekeeping. Today's presentation is for informational and educational purposes. It is not meant to treat, diagnose, cure, or prevent illness, so be sure to discuss any recommendations with your healthcare provider. And just a reminder that some of the links that we shared during this presentation or on our website are affiliate links, which means Mast Cell 360 may take a very small commission if you purchase through our links. We only recommend products that we love or use personally or in the Mast Cell 360 clinic. And your support helps us put on free resources like this show and all of this blog content on our website. So thank you so much for your support. All right, today we're going to be talking about cortisol, your adrenals, and mast cells, signs and symptoms of low or high cortisol and how to test, clinic tips for stabilizing cortisol and supporting your adrenals. And if we have time, we will do a live Q&A. Just a reminder to keep your questions on the topic of today's show and that we are unable to answer in-depth personal health questions. And we do have a lot of content to get through today. We want to make sure that we're providing you guys some real good resources here. So if we don't get to live questions, we will make sure to answer as many as we can in the comments afterwards. So before we get into today's topic, let me introduce our panel. We have Alex Bingham, who is a lead practitioner here at Mast Cell 360, Kimberly Quirk, also a lead practitioner here at Mast Cell 360, and Lachey, who we affectionately call Elle, and she is our emotional support coach here at Mast Cell 360. Thanks so much for being here today, guys.
Hello.
All right, let's jump into our content. Alex, would you lead us off with some brief introduction about cortisol?
Yeah. So, hello, everyone. Happy to be here. So what is cortisol? It's a hormone. It's referred to as our stress hormone. It's the body's way of responding to stress, physical, injury, illness, environmental, mental stress, emotional stress, spiritual stress. It's produced by your adrenal glands. And renal, on top of the renal, they're two small organs on top of your kidneys, and they require support from cholesterol and nutrients to produce hormones. Actually, cortisol is made from cholesterol, and we find that sometimes if the cholesterol level is too low, you're not able to make your steroid hormones adequately. And the other steroid, there's a lot of other steroids hormones in the body, and there'll be a slide later that will show that. But one thing that I just wanted to point out at this point is that when you're under stress, you will produce more cortisol. And at some points, if there's a limited ability to make cortisol, you may sacrifice some of the other steroid hormones to maintain the cortisol. It's that important. It's appropriate to have high cortisol levels when you're stressed, but it's unhealthy to live in a chronically elevated state. And oftentimes what we see is that people who have lived in a chronic state will eventually not be able to produce enough cortisol for their needs. And we'll talk about that. We have the next slide. So the cortisol is released in pulses throughout the day in response to stress. And you can see here, well, this graph is a little bit misleading because this is a urine test. And so it's showing what the urinary levels of cortisol should be at certain points. Now there's going to be a several hour delay between when the adrenal gland makes the cortisol into the blood and when it ends up in the urine. So the waking time here would be a nighttime cortisol. The morning one would be when you wake up. And you can see that it's normal to have a much higher level at that point. And that gets you going through the day, keeps your alertness high, and then it kind of levels off during the day and then falls down at night so that you can relax and sleep. This is a circadian rhythm. And in addition, let's say in the afternoon, some major stress happens. Well, you make more cortisol and raise that level, even though it's already normal or even a little bit elevated, because you may need more cortisol to make it through that experience. Jamie. Now, this is a little bit more complex, but to me, this is the interesting part. And the HPA axis stands for the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And it starts at the level of the hypothalamus, which is in the brain. It's actually part of your limbic system. And it's your master gland. It is responsible for your metabolic rate, your temperature, your blood pressure, your heart rate, like probably other ones that I didn't mention. And it also controls many hormones through the pituitary gland, including cortisol. So what it does is it releases CRH, or cortisol releasing hormone, and that stimulates the pituitary to secrete ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which will stimulate the adrenal glands to make cortisol. Now, as the adrenal glands make cortisol, it will then feed back to the hypothalamus and let the hypothalamus know so the hypothalamus can measure the levels and then decide when to turn off the stimulation or whether to turn it back on again. And this is considered a negative feedback loop. Let me just see. Yeah, so under stress, the hypothalamus will release more CRH so that you get more cortisol. Now, and as I said before, that's an appropriate response. Later, under a lot of duress, if you're living in chronic state, your hypothalamus, which is part of your limbic system, and we see a lot of people with limbic system dysfunction, the hypothalamus may not respond to those needs and may not be able to stimulate the pituitary to stimulate the adrenal gland. And you'll actually see your levels fall, and there'll be a lot of symptoms that can come from that also.
Yeah. So Alex, you just mentioned symptoms. I'm going to pass it over to Kimberly to go over what is that stress response? What are some of those symptoms that may be happening?
Yeah. So cortisol. So with stress, like Alex was saying, your cortisol is going to, respond to that. So what are some of those symptoms? So one thing that happens is raising blood glucose. So why would that happen? Basically, your body is, when you think about your body going into stress or going into sympathetic mode, you're thinking of maybe, your body goes into a mode where you're like running, say you're being chased by a tiger, right? So your body needs to prepare to flee. So it's going to increase your blood glucose in order to fuel your muscles to flee. It also increases your metabolism. So it's turning things over faster to energize your body. So if you need to run from that tiger, increases your alertness, which, can be a problem, where Alex was showing, that cortisol, you want that cortisol to come down at night so you can sleep. So if it's high all the time, you may not be able to rest, relax, and fall asleep. It also can suppress inflammation. It can suppress your immune system. It can also increase the calcium in your blood and break down your bone and inhibit growth. It can raise your cardiovascular function. So think of increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased cardiac output. So your body is getting ready to run from that tiger. Stress response, which we want, but we just don't, like Alex was saying, we don't want to be in a chronic state of stress. Those are really important function of your body. It's not a problem, but it's only when we're stuck in that stress response. That's not a normal way of being for us 24/7, or shouldn't be.
Yeah. And Alex alluded a little bit earlier to the limbic system dysregulation. And, one of the things that we do at Mast Cell 360 with clients is we regulate that nervous system as part of stabilization, because it can regulate the mast cells. So can you talk a little bit about how cortisol and mast cells are related?
Yeah. So your mast cells have so many different receptors on them, right? So for all the messengers that come through our body, like the thyroid hormones, the sex hormones, and cortisol, as of course, as well. So stress hormone. So it's communicating to those mast cells what's going on in the body, and it's the way your body's communicating across to know how to respond appropriately. And those hormones can affect the mast cells in different ways. So if you have an excess of estrogen and testosterone, that tends to activate the mast cells more, versus if you have more progesterone and DHEA and cortisol, it tends to be more mast cell calming. But balance is key, right? And that might ring a bell for a lot of people when you have, if you have your monthly cycle, how those shifts in hormones, especially if they're big shifts, can be very activating, and people tend to have an increase in mast cell symptoms, around mid-cycle or so, when things start to switch over. So yeah, mast cell and cortisol are both very much key players in your stress response and in responding to inflammation. So mast cells interact closely with that HPA axis Alex was talking about, which regulates your cortisol production. And then when those mast cells degranulate or sort of release their different mediators, that increases inflammation and stimulates cortisol release. So it's telling your body, yeah, we have an immune problem here. There's something danger going on, and it activates that immune system. So that cycle over time can strain the adrenals, right? If your body's always in a stress mode, like we were talking about. And it can contribute to a big imbalance in some of these hormones that we're talking about, like cortisol, and can result in cortisol insufficiency for some people and not able to produce that cortisol. So chronically high cortisol can also suppress the release of other anti-inflammatory mediators, potentially worsening some of that immune dysregulation that happens. So if your body is thinking that it's always in a stress mode, it might not be making the T cells that it needs to make, or the natural killer cells that it needs to make to function as a healthy body.
Yeah, and I think today's topic, the stress hormone, right? Like it is also known as the stress hormone, cortisol. So when we think about how this is all related, there is that real emotional wellness component, especially because we often think of stress being more mental, but then like we've talked a little bit about the physical aspect of it, and how we can completely dysregulate other symptoms and systems in the body with that high stress. So I'd love to pass it over to Elf a little bit to go over kind of what's going on, and a little bit more into the adrenal hormones. Oh, Ellie, you're muted. And maybe I can unmute you. There we go. Oh.
There we go. Hello. Okay. All right. Yes. Because the adrenals, let me just lower my own volume here. Because the adrenals are responsible for producing so many of our hormones. Whenever the adrenals get busy, producing cortisol, like Alex was talking about earlier, it's not able to keep producing what's needed, with our hormones. And that includes our sex hormones as well as others. And the thing about that is that those are responsible for, so many different aspects of our body functioning, that it can interfere with a lot. And so it's important to, have that realization whenever we have this chronic increase in cortisol. And even some of the other parts, that happen later on, like progesterone, it still impacts that, even though it may not be directly, produced there. It's still, part of this cascade of effects. And so it's important to have this big picture about, what's happening, especially when it's prolonged, and, how it's contributing to our other symptoms.
Yeah, I think this next slide kind of will help. I think this is what Alex was referencing earlier about how these hormones are made from cholesterol and then they go down these different pathways. And so the cortisol pathway, it's called the pregnenolone steal, right? The adrenals will steal it from this pathway and this pathway. So then therefore we create a whole hormone disruption. And so we can have this imbalance, which we know is possible trigger of mast cell activation syndrome in certain people. All right, let's keep going. All right, so this is just a brain break for everyone. A lot of people are not sure where to begin with understanding hormone imbalances. And so if you are looking for someone to help you test these and understand, is this part of your mast cell activation syndrome? We do use the Dutch test, which we'll go over more in detail later. But it's one thing to do it. It's another thing to have somebody who understands it to interpret it. So if you don't currently have a practitioner you're working with that understands this piece, we do welcome you to apply to the Mast Cell 360 clinic. I'll share that application link right here. And you can get started with one of our lead practitioners to understand if this piece is part of, your own individual puzzle. So you can find the application at mastcell360.com/application if you are looking for a practitioner who may be able to help you understand this hormone piece. All right. Let's see, Alex, can you kind of go over a little bit of the symptoms of like what might be low? I know I see in the comments some people are asking about low cortisol versus high cortisol. So what are some of the symptoms that may be contributing to those? And you can kind of figure out like where someone may be.
Yeah. So if we keep in mind what Kim was talking about when she talked about the effects on the body, then some of these become a little bit more understandable. So in terms of the low cortisol, fatigue is probably the most common that people might connect to that. And it's because you don't convert your food to energy as well with low cortisol. Your temperature might be dysregulated. Generally, we think of people as having cold sensitivity, but the low cortisol actually impairs the metabolic rate, and there's a decreased ability to respond to temperature changes, high or low. And so people can have hyperthermia, they can have hypothermia. Oftentimes what we'll find that people are really cold during the winter and they're totally intolerant of hot, humid weather in the summer. The hypoglycemia, the body, well, the cortisol helps with glucose production. And so it's critical that you have enough cortisol. It also counter-regulates insulin. So if your blood sugar goes up when you eat and your insulin comes out, well, that helps to bring the blood sugar down. But you need something to keep it from keep going down, and that's what cortisol does. It helps. And so oftentimes what we'll see is that people will become hypoglycemic because they don't have enough cortisol to counter-regulate their insulin. In terms of the exercise intolerance, again, decreased energy production, decreased glucose levels. Oftentimes what will happen is that people push too hard and they might rebound and have problems with fatigue and other things, pain, especially for a couple of days. The cortisol affects the activity of neurotransmitters, which can lead to anxiety, depression, other mood disorders. Now, the thirst, salt cravings, orthostatic dizziness, lack of sweating, they are all related to an effect of cortisol in addition to another steroid hormone aldosterone at the level of the kidney. It's very important that the kidney reabsorb almost all the salt that gets filtered from the blood, as well as the water. Now, if the body loses salt, water will follow. Well, that's going to make you thirsty. It's going to lower your blood pressure. You might start craving salt. You might be dizzy when you stand up because you don't have enough blood volume to maintain your blood pressure. And if you're exercising, you might not sweat. We have reports of a lot of people, even in a sauna or a source of heat, won't sweat. And the fact when the sweating starts to recur, that's a great sign that you're moving in the right direction. And in terms of the infections, with a low cortisol, you can't respond to stressors like an infection. And so you're not going to mount that kind of response. In terms of high cortisol symptoms, you can also have fatigue, which I didn't put on here. And you might have trouble sleeping, okay? High cortisol suppresses melatonin production. It dilutes your adenosine, which is a molecule that basically tips you over into a nice restful sleep. In terms of wound healing, because cortisol is a steroid, it's a glucosteroid related to prednisone and things, it can, at an elevated level, it can suppress your immune system. Well, your immune system and inflammation is part of wound healing, okay? And so if you suppress that, you might have trouble healing your wounds. The weight gain, cortisol stimulates your appetite, and it decreases energy production. It increases blood sugar, increases levels of triglycerides and LDL cholesterol, and decreases HDL cholesterol. Great opportunity to develop diabetes, blood pressure problems, cardiac problems, and all those types of things. And in terms of the muscle weakness and the easy bruising, kind of related, is that excess cortisol will break down protein. If it's in the muscles, well, you might have weakness. If it's in the skin, you might find that your blood vessels weaken, and you might be a slight bump might cause excess bleeding or inside the body, causing the bruise. I know that's kind of a lengthy description.
So how do people test this?
The way that we test cortisol are in two forms. And I have to increase this on my computer just so I can read this graph. So this is a diagram of the Dutch test that we like to use. And I really like this in many ways. I think it's the most advanced. We do have another test that we use of saliva. This uses urine. And we use the saliva test when people are not able to limit their fluid intake overnight. A lot of people with POTS and other disorders, they can't limit how much fluid they take in, and they can't do this test, but we have another test. So the diagram here just shows the hypothalamus stimulating the pituitary and then the adrenal gland. And the adrenal gland is going to make cortisol, you can see here. Now, that cortisol is going to be the right-hand graph, and the excess cortisol that might be produced at any time is going to be converted to cortisone. And that's basically that is your reserve capacity. So ideally, you'd like to have more cortisone than cortisol so that you have the ability to make more when you need it. So people who have chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia, people with extreme post-exertional malaise, POTS, dysautonomia, low blood pressure, frequent or debilitating viral or bacterial infections, feeling tired all day, and then getting more energy in the evenings, having a hard time sleeping. These are all indications for us that measuring cortisol would be helpful. Now, it's interesting that all these things we are anticipating a low cortisol as opposed to a high cortisol. People who are under a lot of stress, anxious all the time, kind of living in a fight or flight, initially you're going to have a very high cortisol level. That can be very taxing to the hypothalamus and the brain, and you might end up with your stimulation kind of falling down from the hypothalamus over time. And what you might see is a low cortisol at that point. You can't tell if the cortisol is low if it's because the hypothalamus is not messaging the pituitary to stimulate the adrenal gland, or if the adrenal gland itself can't make the cortisol. But after doing hundreds of the tests in the past, where we would bring people in and give them first thing in the morning, measure their cortisol level, give them a shot of an analog of ACTH, and measure them at 30 and 60 minutes, a healthy adrenal gland is just going to like make a lot of cortisol. And that tells you that it's okay. If you've got a normal test, which we call a cortisol stim test, and abnormally low cortisol, well, then your problem's in the hypothalamus generally. Pituitary disorders are much rarer. And so, so with the knowledge that this graph is a few hours behind what the blood levels are, some of the imbalances you might see something we call flat line, which is like low across the board. This is a fairly flat line picture, okay, where you can see that the morning letter B, which would be reflective of your waking cortisol, is really low. And these are people that might have a lot of trouble waking up, okay, and their fatigue just lasts all day. A person like this might try to do something. They might go shopping. They might take a shower. They might play a game with one of their kids, and they'd be exhausted for the day, or just taking a shower. And at night, they're still low. Some people will have an elevated morning or B level and C level, and that's stress. Okay, these people have abnormal amount of stress, and they're making more cortisol, which is appropriate for stress. It's just not healthy to live in that state. And then sometimes what you'll see are reverse patterns where people are low during the day and then it pops up at night. And you might be a person who just feels exhausted all day, and then evening all of a sudden you come alive, and that's when you get your mental work done. You're available for the important people in your life, and you have a lot of trouble getting to sleep because that's your time. You've got your cortisol at that point. I guess I reversed these. I already said the one level high morning and afternoon, but those are some of the patterns you might see.
Yeah, Alex. So the test that these screenshots were from is the Dutch Adrenal, which we have listed below here. Because like I said, you can order these on your own, but it's one thing to order it. It's another thing to have a practitioner to actually understand it. So, you know, again, you can order these and figure it out, or you can have that support system and do it. So Kimberly, when would be a good time to test more than just the adrenals, right?
Yeah. So, you know, some people are noticing, right? Because all the adrenals, all the hormones interact with each other, right? So sometimes people come in with significant sex hormone issues or issues, you know, around their cycle and things like that, or cycle changes. And sometimes we want to do then a Dutch complete. So the Dutch adrenal was what we were talking about, where you're just looking at the cortisol. The Dutch complete isn't a lot more money. It is a little bit more money, but it looks at both the sex hormone component as well as the adrenal component. And, you know, it can be interesting to kind of look at that to see what else is going on with those sex hormones, how you're detoxing the estrogen metabolites, things like that. So that's when we recommend the Dutch complete. Is usually if somebody's having some issues. But what I like to think about is, you know, the adrenals and the cortisol and insulin and some of those hormones are like your survival ones, which, you know, is because our body really cares about survival. The sex hormones are kind of like the thriving kinds of things. So sometimes I'm like, you know, we really can't have those thriving ones until our other base hormones are in a good place, right? Otherwise, they're all kind of reflecting and changing. But yeah, it can be really interesting to kind of look, because we can support people on the estrogen detox piece if things are, you know, trending too high in some of the metabolites, the way that they're detoxing. And there's certain supplements we can add and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, before going into the mast cell mold world, I was in the pregnancy preconception world, and like we're seeing fertility issues on the rise, and it's like, okay, well, we have to go back down upstream and be like, what's the trigger for those hormones being disrupted? And like one of them is that stress, right? That cortisol, the stress hormone. So we do have to bring those stress levels down, because the body can survive, but it doesn't. If it's only surviving, there's not going to be enough to give to a second human. So, of course, fertility issues, sex hormone imbalances are going to be a secondary problem. And so calming your nervous system down is the key to adrenal recovery. And this is also stage 1 of our stabilization protocol for mast cell activation syndrome that we do in clinic with clients. And so for the next couple of days, our nervous system reboot course is still on sale for $79. Let me drop the link in there for you guys. It is mastcell360.com/mastcell-reboot. So no coupon code necessary if you're catching this on the live. The sale should be live for a few more days as a continuation of our mental health last month in May. So if you're interested at all in learning more about how do you calm the nervous system down to kind of lower that stress and those mast cell reactions to certain stress triggers, this is a great place to start. We also have a ton of free content and previous content on YouTube and on our blog for nervous system. But yeah, it's a great thing to focus on if you're kind of like spinning your wheels and don't know where to begin. We do have to calm the nervous system down in order to support the adrenals, because stress is inevitable, right? It's that chronic stress that becomes the issue. So we have to learn the tools to handle the stress and bring the body back into balance. All right. So Elle, would you share with the audience kind of what are some of the things that raise cortisol, but also some of the things that can help lower cortisol when we need to?
Sound. There we go. Yes. So let's see. We have definitely stress affects multiple areas within ourselves and our lives. And so some of those areas include physical, mental, and emotional. And sometimes we just kind of think of stress as this vague thing that's just happening. And we may not even be able to keep in mind how important it is to manage it. But we can have, basically where we're overworking, physically, where we're overtaxed mentally, we need more breaks, especially with chronic conditions and things like that, and just things that we're worried about, and then emotionally, and that's we just had a live recently on emotional regulation and how all this is connected as well, but a lot of times we're not in a place where we're able to really notice and tend to our emotions. And so that can be an ongoing stress. Intense exercise, we may think that, just because we can go and exercise, some high cardio, feel really good in some ways, but this does increase our cortisol. And if we're already in an elevated place with it, then, continuing to do this as like a regular exercise can contribute to keeping the levels elevated. And so whenever we're realizing that our levels are higher, that's a good place to do a lower level impact with our exercise routines, so that we're giving ourselves time to recover, help kind of lower our average, and kind of get it to where it's in a more manageable place. And then, of course, you can return there. And there's also other benefits to doing some different approaches too. Some of the things I support in is just getting some of the basics down a lot better, which the brain loves too. So sleep deprivation, a lot of our sleep is about recovering. And so that's going to be taxing if we're not able to, recover as well. certain medications that can include corticosteroids like prednisone, a couple others, some psychostimulants like Adderall, and a couple others for ADHD. Those can, just as part of their process, increase our cortisol levels. So if that's done for an extended period of time, that can be contributing there. And then we have some health conditions as well to be aware of. And let's see, of course, stimulants like sugar, caffeine, and alcohol, in moderation at different points in time and conditions, maybe one thing, but once you're more sensitive, your cortisol levels are already higher, that's where those are going to be more impactful. And each of those can have other reasons why they're impactful too, but it's important to note it as part of this. But then there's other things that can help lower cortisol. If we're intentional about it. That can be, again, the moderate exercise or just, whatever is accessible for someone. Again, the ways I support are, help meet people where they're at, whatever level that they're at, build from there. Mindfulness and meditation. This helps, get more present, more regulated. Sometimes it can be hard for people to just jump into that. And that's very normal when we have our elevated cortisol levels, our dysregulated nervous system, all of those things going on, threat responses. Again, it's important to, find ways even to just access that, even just a few times a day or as possible. Gratitude helps. Not to deflect from challenges, but to help us start to hold space for more of a range of experience and helping to kind of shift our experience on some level. This balance is important. Time in nature. This is very naturally grounding. I know just even for myself, even if I just look outside when I've been at the screen for a while or, just walls around me, it's just this automatic shift that I try to stay with for a little bit. So I definitely recommend people, even just breaks from work or something, just to be able to kind of bring in a natural rhythm of regulation. Balanced diet is important. I know, our practitioners here support a lot in this area. Laughter. Laughter is very, it's medicine, right? It's even when there's really hard things going on, sometimes if we can just find some way to access that, it can be a really important shift. It's an important part of our rhythm of life. And then healthy relationships. That is something that people may not even realize that it impacts them. Just whatever dynamics there are can create cycles, and it can be a challenge to notice them or shift them. But definitely getting support in that is really important. That's one of those things that is again, it can be happening in the background and kind of take for granted how impactful it can be. But getting support can go a long way.
Yeah, so it's one thing to understand like some of the things that may be going on in your personal life that could be contributing to higher cortisol, and then like what tools can you do to lower cortisol. It's like the picture on the thing. It's the fine balance between like sometimes when have low cortisol, we actually need to rev it up a little bit, where some exercise or better sleep may be beneficial, right? And so we need to find the balance. So Elle, could you kind of go over like lifestyle? Like at the bottom, it's like make sure you get limbic and vagal work every day. That's like one of the things that we promote at Mast Cell 360. It's like creating that nervous system support routine. Keyword being routine. Like you do it every single day, just like you brush your teeth every single day or shower every single day.
Yes, definitely. Because of how the brain works, it likes predictability and it likes to learn what it can trust. And so a lot of what's been happening with chronic illness and pain and all of that is that the brain's kind of reached a capacity on some level, and it's only doing what it can manage. It's kind of offloading some of those responsibilities. And as we're rebuilding that, the supports, the capacity, then within that, we're teaching the brain, retraining basically about how to trust again, how to feel safe, all of that. And so if we can build in consistency with that, then that's part of that teaching. That's, a reminder. It becomes the familiar, the more like threat, feeling unsafe, oversensitized, things like that have become familiar with these experiences. But as we're able to help shift that and create safety as the familiar piece, then that's where we can really start to see better outcomes.
All right, so went too fast. Kimberly, we know how important sleep is. Can you go into like kind of, in addition to having those daily supports that we do every single day, how do we create a routine to optimize that sleep where that repair is going to happen?
Yeah. So that sleep sometimes if we see the sleep not getting, fixed where people can't sleep, it is such an important piece of healing. So what are some of the things we can do? Some of that is getting back into that circadian rhythm. Like as Alex mentioned before, what we're measuring is the circadian rhythm of the cortisol, right? So how can we, especially if you're someone who is having sleep issues where you're not able to sleep or fall asleep. So could you get some, first thing in the morning, sun in your eyes, it is a communicator to our hormones about time of day and what our body should be doing at that time, and and it sets you up. So ideally, if you do only one thing, getting it first thing within like 30 minutes of waking up would be key. Just stepping outside. I would recommend without glasses, without contacts, because it's light signaling into your eyes. Ideally, it would be great to get some blue light right around midday. And then seeing sunset too can kind of start to cue your body that it's time to go to sleep. I know for me, if I see my dog wandering off to go to sleep without me, that's time for me to go to bed, because they follow that rhythm, right? They, so paying attention to that. Practicing good sleep hygiene. So yeah, staying off your screens. The other thing I do is I don't turn on my overhead lights. I only tend to use lamps at night, because it feels more like candlelight, especially if it's not the LED ones. But using lower level lighting, things like that, just to cue yourself that it's time to wind down, not get blue light. Some people use like those orange dark, if you had to be on electronics, using what are the blue blockers, that kind of thing. So having something that your body is looking forward to, so like a wind down bed routine. A lot of clients like to do their nervous system work at bedtime too. Like they might have a morning routine and then a nighttime routine that's kind of calming, and avoiding any kind of stress you can, like having deep conversations that maybe it's a disagreement that you have, that can kind of raise your cortisol and make you not able to sleep. Aiming for a good 8 hours of sleep. I know when I was super sick, my ND at the time was like, aim for 12 hours. I needed a lot of sleep to recover. And I don't need as much now, which is great. So being in bed well before midnight is beneficial. I know sometimes people are like, oh, I got 8 hours. I've had a client who said, oh, I go to bed at 2 and I sleep till 10. And yes, that's great. He's getting those 8 hours. But I'm like, be asleep by midnight, because a lot of what happens with detox happens after midnight. So think about that too. It's not just about the 8 hours, it's about those 8 hours, right? That and your circadian rhythm and what your body is doing. And then nap as much as you need to, as long as it's not interfering with sleep. So, for me, I did nap a lot, but I would kind of keep it to not go into that 4-hour nap, right? Try to keep it to a half hour or 45 minutes or something like that, where it was a little power nap versus a asleep.
Yeah, so sleep's really important. So is nourishment.
Yeah, nourishment's super important too, right? So stabilizing blood sugar is huge for regulating that cortisol. Insulin and cortisol talk a lot. And sometimes it's like with chicken or eggs, which one's out of balance there. But yes, thinking about stabilizing your blood sugar, not stressing your body out and going too long without eating, but also not overeating, right? And overdoing it, especially sugars and things like that, and things that are going to shoot up our blood sugar. But eating within an hour or two of waking, preferably something with protein in it, maybe some fiber. Yeah, if you have adrenal fatigue, it's not a time to fast. I know fasting is like a big thing right now. But if you're dealing with some chronic illness and some adrenal fatigue, that's not the time to maybe start fasting. Yeah, and staying hydrated, huge, right? So we use hydration to detox, really important to not just water, but also thinking about your electrolytes, especially if you're someone who has more the blood pressure issues and the POTS-like symptoms and the dizziness. So making sure you're getting that sodium, potassium, magnesium in the water, especially if you're urinating a lot, right? Because you're then losing a lot of electrolytes. So avoiding, stimulants, right? So caffeinated beverages, chocolate, alcohol, those kinds of things that can just throw off and stress the adrenals. And yeah, and then this is a good note, just, no carbs. So finding that sweet balance of carbs, right? So you're supporting your body with some slow release carbs, like maybe a winter squash or some beans, depending on what you tolerate. But yeah, not overdoing the sugar piece for sure.
All right. So I did see a question. Olga was asking how to increase cortisol other than supplements. But before we answer that, unless Alex or Kimberly would like to, or Elle, we do have some supplements. Alex can answer those questions as well. So Alex, do you want to answer Olga's question, or do you want to go over supplements first?
Well, I think we can probably do both with this, because I think that when you're talking about helping the adrenal gland to recover, what's been said already is the most important stuff. If your nervous system is placing excessive demands on your adrenal gland, it's going to be very hard to get better. The sleep, the limbic system, and vagus nerve, that's really the answer. Now, supporting during the time that you're healing, you can divide into two parts. You can replace the hormone, or you can do an adaptogenic approach. Now, replacing the hormone, the most bioidentical hormone we have is hydrocortisone, which was developed in the 1940s. And it was for people with Addison disease. In my training, using a steroid was considered problematic, and we saw so many problems with steroids that basically I didn't see anyone who was being treated with hydrocortisone. But in the last 25 years or so that I've been doing this, I find that it can be very helpful. The point is that you don't want too much steroid, and that's what we mostly get: high doses of prednisone to suppress asthma, or used in cancer, or rheumatoid arthritis and stuff. And you don't want too low cortisol and having the immune system overactive, allergies, autoimmune disorders, and things like that. You want it to just be right. Okay, so things like allergies and autoimmunity oftentimes occur in the setting of low cortisol, because the cortisol helps to balance that immune system. And at the same time, you don't want too much. So you can use hydrocortisone, and that's really the only way I know of non-supplemental adjuncts to your nervous system work and nutrition and sleep and things like that. In terms of the nutrients, you need a lot of B5, you need chromium, you need vitamin C. And in the balancing, the adaptogens we think of as more herbal. Okay, ashwagandha, which is a nightshade, so people have to be careful in that response. In that regard. Eleuthero, which is Siberian ginseng, rhodiola, holy basil. These can be used and will help whether you're high or low, but some have a certain benefit. Rhodiola seems to be more helpful for low cortisol, holy basil for high cortisol. And then you've got your glandulars. Now, typically people will use an adrenal glandular, but as we've talked about, the HPA axis is the key. And getting a glandular that has hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal, and some have gonadal glandulars as well, I think is a great way to help to try to balance some of that. And then for the people that have cortisol that's too high, especially around nighttime and things like that, you can help to bring it down with phosphatidylserine. You can bring it down with ashwagandha. You can bring it down with magnolia. These are just some of the things that you can use as adjuncts. Now, what was Olga's question again?
It was what can you do to increase cortisol other than supplements?
Medication. I mean, really, and calming down the things that are causing. Well, like one thing would be if one of the problems is that you're living in a toxic situation, getting rid of the toxins would be really key. Living in mold, things like that. So you need to limit the things that you're being exposed to, heavy metals, things like that.
Yeah. All right. So just a reminder, we're unable to answer in-depth personal health questions. I am going to throw some up there to see if we can answer as many as possible in the remaining time we have. All right, let's get that down. Okay. Olga's asking how MCAS is affected if cortisol is extremely low.
Well, I think that one of the things that happens there is that you're not controlling your immune system. It's overreactive. So an overreactive immune system, allergies, things like that, is triggering to mast cells. And so a low cortisol situation can certainly increase your mast cell activity. By the same token, getting your cortisol managed and raising it will actually help to lower your mast cell activity.
Okay, so the opposite of that, Amy, and again, we're not answering this. We don't know why your cortisol levels are high 24/7 specifically. You would have to find those triggers, but we did go over some of the reasons why cortisol levels are high. So you can always revert back to the replay of today's show and see, are you doing any of those things? But Alex or Kimberly or Elle, do you have any advice?
Yeah, I mean, it's looking right at both the triggers we talked about, like could be mold, things like that. But, kind of being honest with yourself, do I have something stressful going on, right? Am I having trouble sleeping? Am I eating right? And all the things, and kind of looking at what could hint to what's going on for you. But yeah, looking at the environment as well is going to be huge.
Yeah. So what is that stressor? So it may be like a death of a family member. That's a very stressful event in your life, but also the physical stressors that are taxing your body, like that mold exposure. It's about doing an inventory of your individual triggers. So again, we can't say why your levels are high 24/7, but if you've tested and know they are, then it's time to do some evaluation and lifestyle changes maybe. Okay, I want to answer Lisa's asking, are these applications open to UK residents as well? So we are taking international clients, but we ask that you start with a strategy session so that we can evaluate if we are able to support you, how our clinic is set up, which is based in Eastern Time, US. So we do start all international clients with a strategy session. So if you know that going into the application, you can start there and we can discuss whether or not we're the right fit for you. Okay, Janet is asking, can you have low and high symptoms at the same time or day to day? So one day may be high, one day may be low. Anyone want to take it?
I mean, yeah, it can change, right? I mean, that could be very related to the nervous system, right? That's, whether you are in more of a stressful situation. So yeah, the symptoms can shift day to day as your because your nervous system isn't static, like is changing day to day too, and how you're responding and your stress level.
Yeah, one way I like to look at these types of things is that, like Kimberly says, things can change day to day. Like everyone's hardwired to be healthy. Everything your system is programmed to do is to return you to a state of health. But there are thresholds, and if you cross a threshold, you don't get back without some kind of active intervention. And there are a lot of people living right at that edge. And one day they're over and one day they're under. And so I think if you're having high and low and it's hard to figure that out, you need to figure out kind of like what is keeping you over that threshold or right at that threshold. You have to find out what are the root causes that are putting you in that situation, and start to chip away at that.
Yeah. Okay. So Amy asked an earlier question. She has just done a Dutch test, and can we use this? So Amy, if you're referring to working with our practitioners, that would be the advanced track route. So I will just, let me show you guys real quick, take a break here from questions. All right, so if we have 2 tracks of clients, so I mentioned for international clients, we recommend, we require everyone internationally to start with a strategy session. That's our foundational tier. If we determine in the strategy session that we're able to meet each other's needs, then you would go on to the advanced track. For review of the Dutch test, that would be the advanced track. So that more comprehensive overall approach would be to work with a lead practitioner. So you'd want to apply for the advanced track. In strategy sessions, those are great for kind of like next steps as far as evaluating what your current case is, and have you filled in all the stabilization pieces yet, or have you evaluated for mold, more of the basics, or if you're brand new to MCAS and kind of feel overwhelmed and don't know where to begin. So those are kind of the 2 tiers that you can apply for. And again, I'll just throw up the link that you can find all of the different applications here is mastcell360.com/application. You'll also see the link to work with Elle, whether that's an emotional support session or something called SSP, Safe and Sound Protocol. All of that is on this application page that you can find. All right, let's see. Do we have time for a couple more questions? What impact does adrenal insufficiency have on mast cell activation syndrome? So again, this is that low cortisol. I think Alex answered that, but if you could just recap it.
Well, the way I look at it is that when you're low cortisol, you oftentimes have excessive immune function, allergies, autoimmune disorders, things like that are very activating. Cortisol helps to calm mast cells, and the lack of cortisol will allow other things to cause more mast cell activation.
I feel like that's really confusing, that like it's the stress hormone and stress can be a trigger, but also cortisol can calm mast cells.
It's all about balance, right?
Yeah.
It is. It's like finding that Goldilocks zone of everything, because the body wants balance.
And I also feel like, again, with that, it's like not black and white. And so like what's a stressor for you may not be as much of a stressor for someone else. And so it's all about feeling empowered and listening to your own body and seeing like, does something work for you or not work for you individually? Okay, Janet is asking, what if the trigger is pollen and you can't go outside? We know how important it is to go outside to get that morning light. We know how important it is for the nervous system to feel grounded. So alternatives for that in the morning?
Yeah, I mean, definitely looking at the pollen counts, right? Like, so maybe some days you just can't, if it's that much of a trigger for you. I have seen people open windows, but still that's going to let the pollen in. Wearing a mask is an option, right? Because you can still get the light in your eyes, and it doesn't have to be for a long amount of time. It literally can be 5-10 minutes. So weighing how, how reactive you are to that pollen and how high that pollen level is on that day.
You can sit in a sunny window. You can get light boxes that will give you full spectrum light, which is very helpful in the wintertime, especially. So there are other ways of doing it. But, having to stay inside because of allergies is a real problem. I mean,
we want to address the nervous system. Can we retrain the brain to be not reactive? Can we lower our histamine in other areas of our life so that we're not as reactive to that pollen? So the nervous system piece, the food and diet piece, do we add in some histamine degrading supplement like DAO so that we can tolerate that pollen better so that eventually we can get outside more? Okay. We are about out of time. Alex, Kim, Elle, did you see any more comments come in that you want to answer real quick?
I just wanted a couple things. Olga, you really pushed us today with a lot of good questions. But just in general, we discourage people who are need to be on a low oxalate diet from using glycine, which can raise those levels. One source of vitamin C that's low oxalate and low histamine is camu, which is a tree berry and very good for vitamin C. And I noticed that you asked if rhodiola was low oxalate. It is.
Yeah. So I'm trying to find all the questions real quick. Okay. Our team does a really good job posting afterwards on the replay when these questions were answered. So, these are all on Facebook. We stream on both Facebook and YouTube. Facebook is implementing some new things where these videos get taken down. So if you're looking for the replay for this, we highly recommend, making sure that you go over to our YouTube channel, subscribe there so that you get notifications. Okay.
Rhonda had a really good question there. Do you see that one about saliva versus blood? Okay. So is it saliva cortisol or blood cortisol? So the Dutch test, Dutch stands for dried urine testing. So it is a urine test for the Dutch. We also sometimes do a saliva test. The one issue with usually the blood test is usually it's a one-time test. What we like about like a dried urine test is you'll have multiple collections throughout the day to see your pattern, because it's really about looking at that pattern. Same with the saliva. The blood, just because you're in the lab to do it, it's generally like a one-time test. So it's it doesn't have that pattern, right? The pattern throughout the day that would show with some of these tests, like a Dutch test.
Yeah, I agree. And to expand on that, when your hormone is released into the blood, much of it is going to be carried around your body on protein, and there's a little bit that's floating free. The blood test measures everything. The saliva test and the dried urine measures the free cortisol. That's what you have to work with. And so oftentimes the blood level will overrepresent your free cortisol. In addition, if you're getting up and you're getting dressed and you're driving to a lab, by the time you get there, your AM cortisol is not what it was when you woke up. And also, you're going to be stabbed by the phlebotomist. So, all those things will tend to raise your cortisol more than what it was when you woke up.
Amy, I just want to clarify, you can apply for the advanced track to have your Dutch test reviewed. If you want your Dutch test reviewed by a lead practitioner, that is the advanced track. So you can't do a one-time strategy session for the Dutch test. That would be the advanced track. Okay. Well, thank you everyone so much for being here with us today. We hope that you enjoyed this talk. We'll be back next week on Monday for another live on hormones. Thanks so much, everyone. Any parting words from our practitioners?
Balance. That's my word, balance. Like look full picture. Like it's not just the supplements. It's the lifestyle, the supplements, what your root cause is, internal, external. Look at all the pieces and be truthful with yourself and trying to find that balance, because that's what the body wants.
Yeah, I'd also say that with the nervous system, sometimes we're not aware that we're dysregulated because it's just our norm, because that's been our experience. And we just kind of live in this functional state of either overactive or a little bit shut down, functional freeze, or kind of in between them. And so, just gaining some awareness around that and how to support some real changes there is really important.
Yeah, and I would just advise hang in there. Most of the people that we see don't fit into the box. They're out of the box of what medicine sees. And it's not just one problem. There's a bunch of things. And hang in there until you find out what's really going on for you. And then look for the people that can help you and support you through your journey, because they're out there. And there is a journey that will get you back to a better place. I truly believe that.
Yeah, and I just want everyone to celebrate the win that you made it to this live today, or if you're watching the replay, you took the initiative to watch this replay and continue to educate yourself, because you can only do the best you can with the knowledge that you have. And so by being here, you're increasing your knowledge, and that is a win. So celebrate that today. All right, guys, we'll see you next time. Have a good one.